Put on some hush puppy shoes. Let's play it one time. Woo!
Hey there, everybody. It's Geezer Bill, and I'm joined by my fellow geezers. What happens when a band replaces its lead singer? It's an interesting topic. We thought we'd try to tackle it with some of the bands that we're familiar with and maybe some that we're not. And we're going to start it off with Scott, who's going to talk about one of his favorite bands, Genesis. Scott?
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, Genesis. This obviously, when you talk about replacement singers that are a success, this is obviously one of the first bands that anybody thinks of, whether you're a fan or not. Everybody knows the story. They were emerging prog gods back in the 70s during the Peter Gabriel era. Peter Gabriel left in 1975. Phil Collins took over as lead singer, and then they became huge pop music hit-making machines. And that's the story, except, that's not really what happened. Peter Gabriel left in 1975 as they completed their tour for The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which was their big magnum opus, and the album that pretty much started putting them on the map, especially here in the United States. They'd started making some inroads with us, the previous album, Selling England by the Pound. But then this one came out, and after 5 or 6 years of trying, they finally did it. They finally started making some noise in the United States. And then what happens? Their dynamic, well-known, high-profile frontman says, I'm done. I want to go do something else. So now what are we going to do? We're just getting out of debt. We're hitting our peak. What are we going to do? Well, what we did was we got together and started working on material for a new album, doing rehearsals, rehearsing the songs, recording demos and things, but still not knowing what we're going to do for a lead singer. They brought in a lot of people to audition as lead singer to replace Gabriel, and they just couldn't find anybody they were happy with. Now, during the Gabriel years, Phil Collins joined the band in 1971, around there, and he did a little background singing. He sang he sang lead on a couple of basically filler tracks on a couple of the earlier albums, and he was a good background singer. He could carry a tune if it was a small, quiet tune, but that's what they thought was the problem. They didn't know if Phil was good enough to play the bangers that they were working on. So one of the songs that they had written for their new album was called Squonk, which is just a pretty heavy rock and roll banger. And they decided, well, we're going to go ahead and record Phil singing because he can do it, and just put this music out and see what we got. And he sang Squonk, which was a big test, and he did a pretty good job on it.
Red rag hangs from an open mouth. White the both ends, a little dead and made out. We're talking and a bombing, we will go.
They said, well, this worked pretty well. So I said, Phil, why don't you be the singer? And Phil goes, I want to play the drums. I don't want to sing. And in fact, Collins was suggesting to them, let's just carry on as an instrumental band. Let's just do instrumentals. And they all went, no. So Phil reluctantly agreed to go ahead and sing the lead on these songs so they could get an album out while they continued their search. The album was A Trick of the Tail, which was released in 1976, about a year after Gabriel left. I bought this album, Trick of the Tail, came in, put it on my turntable, and I thought, man, this is really good. This is a good record. It didn't really fundamentally change the sound of Genesis. It wasn't The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, that was their big over-the-top spectacles. Now, Trick of the Tail came back, and it sounds a little more. It's more in the vein of some of their earlier albums that that didn't have this overarching theme to it, not a concept album or anything. But I heard it sound pretty good, and it sounded to me like an album if this album could have come out if Peter Gabriel was lead singer, and it sold well. It became it continued their momentum that they were building an audience in the United States, and it worked. And so they went out and hired Bill Bruford, who was probably the one prog drummer in the 1970s who you could say was better than Phil Collins. Well, they hired him to play the drums on their tour coming up, while Collins went out in front of the stage to sing these songs. And then there were times they actually had two drum sets set up on stage, and you know, there would be instrumental passages or whatever, which Genesis did a lot of, where they would have two drummers and two really, really good drummers on stage at the same time playing against each other, Bill Bruford and Phil Collins, right? So then they came back pretty quickly, recorded a second album with this lineup as a four-piece. Tony Banks, Michael Rutherford, Steve Hackett, and Phil Collins. Wind and Wuthering, which was pretty good. It wasn't as good as Trick of the Tail, but it was still a pretty good Genesis album. And then what happened was that Steve Hackett, he had some things he wanted to do and he couldn't get them done in a band setting, so he left. The band decided not to replace Steve Hackett, just make Michael Rutherford, who was their bass player, just let him handle the lead guitar duties as well as the bass guitar duties, and go on from there. That's when Genesis became what we know of Genesis of the 1980s. Because now, you know, Tony Banks now pretty much became the main composer of the group. Well, he and Rutherford both were, but what it is that the next album, and then there were three, which was the third album that Phil Collins was a lead singer on. Well, that one was their first one that they did as a trio, and that just became just all keyboard dominated by Tony Banks. They did just basically 3 or 4 minute songs as opposed to 7 or 8 or 10 minute songs that they had been doing before, and that's pretty much when they really took that big leap into pop stardom. You know, Phil Collins then became a big, huge superstar. The band became superstars, and then there was one more little change that happened right at the end there, along about 1996. Collins decided that he wanted to go concentrate on his solo career. That Banks and Rutherford had already pretty much put together some material for another album. And, you know, by this time Genesis had just become just straight manufactured pop. You know, they put out 2 albums that were huge sellers, had some huge selling singles on it. You know, they were just turning out product by this point. And Collins left, and they went in and wrote a bunch of songs. They ended up finding this obscure guy from a band called Stiltskin. His name is Ray Wilson from Scotland. And so they brought him in and had him do lead singer. And they released an album in 1997 called Calling All Stations, which was just awful. You know, it didn't sound like Genesis. It sounded more like just some second-rate hard rock thing that happened. And but they were going to go out on tour to support this album, and they couldn't sell any tickets, so they ended up canceling the tour. People were just telling they didn't want any part of this thing anymore. So they disbanded, but they all got together a few years later to promote a box set that the record company was putting out. And the 5 of them got together: Gabriel, Hackett, and Collins, Rutherford, and Banks got together and did some interviews and promoted. And they actually talked about reforming again as a 5-piece and do the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour again. But Gabriel couldn't do it because he had so many other things going on. And Hackett decided that, he didn't want to get back into that thing again. So, but the 3 of them got back together and they went out on this big tour, first time in 14 years, and sold a bunch of tickets and became pop star Genesis again. And then, as we all know, they just finished up their farewell tour a couple of 3 months back. And I guess that's the end of Genesis.
Very interesting. So, I mean, it's intriguing that you can have a band that has two distinct careers essentially that has essentially the same personnel more or less for a good chunk of those years, and that because of one change, you end up with this and that, and it's very interesting.
Right, but it wasn't the change that everybody thinks it was.
That's a great.
That it wasn't the change from Gabriel to Collins. It was a change from Steve Hackett to nobody.
Just a little bit more time left to leave out my well, put down your Playboy, put on some hush puppy shoes. Let's play it one time.